Okay, on this link number 2, I'm going to be working through the problems with you. And you can see right here, it's wanting you to put the parabola from standard form to vertex form. So the first thing when you're looking is you want to ask yourself, does your A equal 1? Okay. If A does not equal 1, you have to do a few more steps. So if A does not equal 1, you have to factor it from the quadratic and linear term. Okay, so A needs to equal a positive 1. Okay, so if you notice right here, the very first thing I notice about number 1 is A equals a negative 1. Okay, now number 2, A does equal 1. So if it doesn't equal 1, you're going to have to factor whatever A was from the quadratic and linear term. Now, what factor means is it just means to divide it out. So you're going to divide it out. So right here for this first one, remember I mentioned if it had f of x, to change that to y. So I'm going to go ahead and put my blanks. I'm going to factor out that number that's not a 1. So I'm going to take out the negative 1. And I'm going to leave the negative 4 to the outside. Okay. Now, when you factor out that negative 1, it's going to change both of those signs to its opposite. Now, what you do next is you take half of this number B. So you're going to take half of 2 and square it. So you can use the calculator, especially when the problems get a little bit more difficult. But you're going to divide the middle term by 2, and then you're going to square it. So there's going to be a 1 that goes in that blank right there. Now, to get your other blank, you have to multiply this number to that blank. So if I multiply negative 1 to 1, I need to put a negative 1 on that side. Okay, next I'm going to bring this down. I'm just going to change that to a minus 1 now. I'm going to put the negative and a parenthesis because it's understood to be a negative without that 1. And I'm going to put a minus 4. Okay, the next thing you're supposed to do is you're supposed to factor this right here. Now, when you factor that, it comes to what's called a double factor. It comes to the same thing, okay? You always ask yourself what multiplies to be 1 and adds to be 2, and it's going to be the same number, okay? So that would be 1 and 1. So that factors to x plus 1 times x plus 1. Then I'm going to add the 1 over. Change your y equals back to your f of x when you're finishing up the problem. And then I put together negative 4 plus 1, and that gives you a negative 3. It's always easier to put that y down first and just go back and change that y to f of x at the end. Now, when you look at that vertex, Remember, the inside number is the opposite sign, and the outside number is the same. So your vertex would be at -1, -3. Now, when A is equal to 1, all you have to do is go through and just group the quadratic and the linear together and leave the 30A hanging outside. Notice that you didn't have to factor out anything because your A was already equal to 1. If it's not equal to 1, that's when you have to divide that number out from those first two terms. Okay, so we're going to take half of -12 and square it. Go ahead and see if you can get that number. That would give us a 36. Well, if there's nothing in front of that parentheses but a 1, when you multiply 1 to that 36, you just get back that number. So you would have 36 going on that side. So I'm going to bring that part down. I need to factor the middle to the same thing double. Now, when you're thinking of factoring this, it's going to be a perfect square. So what multiplies to be 36 and adds to be a -12? Well, you would need two negatives to multiply to be a positive and add to be a negative. So it would be 6 and 6. Notice you're getting the same factor double. That's why I'm writing it this way. Now I'm going to subtract the 36. Change the y equals to f of x. And I get 2. See if you can put your vertex down. Don't forget, when you're doing these questions, double check if you have the correct answer by putting in the original problem, which would have been this one, and the one that you've rearranged, and those should be the identical graph. So your vertex should be at 6, 2. Okay, so my A is 1 here, so I don't have to factor anything out. Looks like we're starting to get into some fractions. Don't let that confuse you. It's still the same. Okay, you probably want to use a calculator when you're dealing with the fraction. It just might make it a little simpler. So I'm going to take the 5 and I'm going to divide it by 2. And don't forget to square it. Go ahead and change it back to a fraction when you get that answer. Some people can do that in their head and square 5 and get 25 and square 2 and get 4. So that's going to go to 25 fourths. Since there's a 1 in front of that parentheses, when I multiply that to 25 fourths, it's just going to stay 25 fourths. Now I'm going to show you a shortcut to factoring that some people might like. Okay, when you complete the square to put things into vertex form in what we're doing, you're getting a perfect square trie. So if you will think about two things that would multiply to give you x squared. So you think about the square root of that, which would be x. You always keep the first sign, which is plus. And you think about the square root of 25 and the square root of 4. They're going to be perfect squares, so that would give you 5 halves. If you added 5 halves and 5 halves, you would get 10 halves, which would go to 5. Okay, so let's look at that shortcut again. You can take the square root of the first one and get x. the square root of the last one and get 1. Keep the middle sign. The square root of the first one and get x. The square root of 36 and get 6. Keep the middle sign. Okay. Now, as we go to number 4, you notice your a is not 1. So we're going to have to take out the -1 when we get to that one in a second if you're ahead of me. So I'm going to go ahead and recopy this over. And looks like I already did that, didn't I? Sorry. So I'm going to subtract 25/4. And now put those two together if you haven't. And then math, enter. So it's -1/4. And I'm just going to go back and put the f of x since that's what the original problem started with. And so your vertex would be -5/2 and -1/4. Now, if you were graphing that by hand, anytime you deal with fractions, I would probably look at the decimal value if I was trying to graph that. So that would be, the vertex would be at -2.5 and -0.25. That might just give you a better indication of where that vertex of that parabola would be located. Now, if you feel like you're doing pretty good, just keep going and check your answers, or just pause the video and see how you do with the problem. Now, I'm noticing there's a negative there, so I need to take out the -1. So it's going to change both of those signs. Remember, don't touch that 21 right there. So you're taking out the number in front of your x squared. You're taking out that -1. And when you divide those by -1, it's going to change both of their signs. Okay, so now we're going to take half of -4. And once you get these steps down pat, it becomes a little bit easier. You're going to take half of -4 and square it. So I'm going to put a 4 here. I'm going to have to multiply that because that's in the parentheses with -1 in front. So there would be a -4 on that side. Now I'm going to go ahead and add this over because you can start, once you start seeing things, you can do some shortcut tricks. So this would go to negative, and that would be a 25 right there. Now see if you remember how to factor it. You got two of the same things. Take your square root, keep the middle sign, and square root. So I hope you got x minus 2 squared. I'm going to change my y to f of x. So that would be my vertex form. Write your vertex down. So remember, vertex is opposite inside, outside the same. So it moves to the right 2 and up 25. And this parabola should be opening down. Okay, I've got 2 left. Okay, so this A is a 4. So I'm going to have to take that out. Remember, leave the 8. You're taking whatever that is out of those 2. So go ahead of me and divide both of those by 4. So if I divide that by 4, I'm left with x squared minus x plus blank. Okay, go now and take half of your b and square it. So I'm taking half of -1 and I'm squaring it. So that gives me 1/4. Multiply that to the number in front, and that should give you a 1. See if you can finish. I'm going to go ahead and subtract that 1. And I'm going to put the f of x there. I'm going to put the quantity squared plus 7. See if you can figure out what you're going to rewrite that to right here. Okay, so you know it should be x, and I hope you know to keep that sign we've been talking about. Take the square root of 1/4, so the square root of the top and the bottom, and it goes to 1/2. Now you might be noticing that it's going to go back to what it was to begin with. So if you think back to where we took half of that, the -1/2, it's going to go back to that also. So this parabola would be getting skinnier. See if you can put your vertex down. So your vertex would be 1/2 and 7. Okay, the last one would be the toughest if you want to pause and see if you can get it. So I'm going to take the -2 out because a is not a 1. I'm going to take it out of the first two terms. Leave the -11 out. So what you're doing is you're dividing that by -2 and you're dividing that by -2. So if you divide any number by itself, you get the 1, and that's what you're wanting there. 22 divided by -2 gives you a -11. And you can always check that by distributing to look back above. Okay, go ahead and take half of your middle term and square it. And we'll change it to a fraction. So I have 1/21/4. I'm going to multiply that to the -2 that's in front, and I'm going to get -121/2. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and write this over since we're dealing with a lot of these fractions. We're going to factor that next. Okay, so your square root of x squared is x. You keep that sign. The square root of 121 is an 11. The square root of 4 is 2. So remember, it's where we took half of that number before we squared it. Now we're going to add 121/2 to the -11. I'm going to change that to the f of x. And that gives me a 99/2. Now, sometimes you might notice they might put those in decimals, and you might notice that. So I'm going to put the vertex in decimals because when I graph, I kind of like to have an idea of where that turnaround point is going to be. So if I did that vertex, -11/2 would be 5.5 because I would change the sign, remember. And then this one, I believe we had a while ago, 49.5. So if you ever need to do that, remember you could just leave that as that decimal form, or you could take the fractions and you could divide them at that point. And remember, the inside is the opposite side. Now, if you struggle with this, just keep practicing. I would try these problems again, especially if this is the first time you've dealt with this, because once you get it and you get the routine down, it's not too bad. It just takes a minute to understand first. I hope you have a great day.